25 years ago, Bruce Peter Lee was revealed to be Britain's worst serial killer. Lee confessed to murdering 26 people over a period of 7 years.
And he had hate in his eyes, and he said, "I despise people, and I'm devoted to fire."
Bruce Lee began starting fires at the age of 9. He first killed when he was 12 and wasn't caught until he was 19. It was the tenacity of one police officer that brought Lee to justice. Ron Seager, then a detective superintendent working in the poor dock area of Hull.
He was and is an insignificant-looking person. People in the area often referred to him as Daft Peter. My goodness, he was far from being simple.
Who would expect, who would be willing to accept that someone was creeping around, a man with no real presence? You'd see him anywhere and not notice him. He's one of these people who could creep into a crowd anywhere, no one would notice him. But all the time he was wandering around Hull for quite a number of years with a plastic bottle hidden under his jacket from which he could squirt paraffin and throw a match or two after it. And he did this, you know, far too many times. And no one suspected anything. And that I think is quite awful. People lost their lives who shouldn't have done.
25 years ago, Seager took part in a film documenting his investigation into the Hull Firestarter. It began with an arson attack on 12 Selby Street. 3 children, boys aged 8, 12 and 15, were killed. Seager arrived at the house in the early hours of a cold December morning. He remembers it clearly, a quarter of a century later.
I went to the front of the house and one could clearly detect a smell of paraffin in the air. And simply looking around, despite the fact that the fireman had been there busy putting the fire out, one could see 3 or 4 spent matches on the ground nearby. And also a stain on the concrete. As it turned out, it was a stain from a paraffin can that had been put back behind whoever had set fire to the house. And in fact, the house had been set alight by someone who poured a considerable amount of paraffin through the letterbox, pushed paper through, lit the paper, and the whole house went up in flames.
One member of the family escaped harm. Angie Hasty was out babysitting that night.
Police come in at 5 o'clock in the morning, I think it was, and they said there's been a fire at your house. So I said, it must have been the paraffin heater then. I said, it's toppled over or something. And they said, oh no, it's worse than that. And then they said that the brothers had gone to Pinterfield hospitals. So they went there, my mum was in Hull Royal. The police took me to see my mum in hospital. And when I saw her, I just didn't recognise her whatsoever. Because she was all burnt, all her hair was burnt, all her hands was in bags from the burns, and I screamed and walked out. And I didn't help but cry for days and days and days.
Mrs. Hasty escaped, and frankly, it's due to the bravery of her son Charles, the 15-year-old, who died in the fire, because he got his mother and literally bundled her out of the bedroom window.
It was only our Charlie that was awake, and he said, look, Mum, you go get the help, because she was going to drop him out the window, you see. But he said, no, you go and get the help, I'll get the others. But they found him unconscious on the floor, because he did go back to save him.
And I knew that morning when I arrived here that the body service burns were so great that the chances of them recovering was frankly nil.
I mean, I've never forgot my brothers. They didn't deserve to die in a fire. Charlie, he died first on the 5th of December. Our Peter, he died on the 7th of December. And then our Paul, he hung out and he died the 13th of December. Because he'd gone along like nearly a fortnight and we thought, oh, he's going to pull through a bit, you see. But then he died.
A funeral in Yorkshire for 3 boys who died at the hands of an arsonist. Their distraught mother sought justice.
I'll let you all up. Wait a minute, no, you leave go. You leave go, mate.
January 4th, 1980. Edith Hastie barely stayed in control at the funeral of her boys.
I've been back from Selby Street.
She was convinced the killer was in the crowd of onlookers.
January, but I'm going to tell you, I'll never give up. I never will. And you can touch my head, you can do what you like. Come on. It's one of them. It's one of that crowd. It's one of them who's done it. I'm telling you. It's one of them.
Well, that's why I had the burial down Selby Street, because I just wanted the person caught who'd done this terrible thing. And I thought, well, I go in down Selby Street and them seeing the coffins like that, it might fetch the murderer out.
Seager's investigation was complicated by the fact that many people held a grudge against the Hastie boys.
We found that we had literally dozens and dozens of suspects. All those people who were aggravated in one way or another tended to become suspects for us.
But we had many, many complaints of the boys throwing stones at old ladies, throwing stones through windows, assault, demanding money with menaces from the cubs who attended the church hall at the top of the street. It appears that whenever the Hastie boys knew that a cub was on his way to the church hall, they knew only too well that he would have 15 pence in his pocket. And my goodness, it appears that they would have that 15 pence from the cub in no time at all.
Documentary makers Clive Entwistle and Paul Dunstan followed the investigation as it spread its net over weeks and months. They were increasingly impressed by the quiet determination of Ron Seager.
I think the extraordinary thing, of course, was Seager himself. I mean, we were both struck by him. And you can see him on the screen, even today. You cannot believe that that is a policeman. He does not fit the archetypal image of a policeman.
Not at all.
He's a kindly, if you like, the second master or the history master at a school.
The catalyst and the key to the whole of this thing is Ron Seager. Nobody else. Ron Seager cracked this case single-handed because of his determination, his tenacity, his belief that he couldn't allow 3 children, 3 young boys, to die and nobody brought to book.
It wasn't easy for Seager. The only clue he had was an anonymous phone call made to the police just days after the Hastie fire.
Hello, this is the police. I'm sorry for all your damage down Selby Street. I didn't mean it.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I'm sorry for all your damage down Selby Street. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it.
You're sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's your name?
No.
Well, it's no saying you're sorry, is it?
But the tape proved to be no help in tracking down the arsonist. 18,000 people had been interviewed. Over 6 months, Seager's investigative team had been reduced to a skeleton, but he refused to give up.
I came up here really to analyse all that we'd done and to just have a bird's eye view of all I could see from this particular point. We were almost at desperation point in that we'd analysed and followed up every possible avenue of inquiry we could, and we were left with next to nothing.
With nothing to go on, Ron was left with guesswork and a copper's intuition.
Perhaps, just perhaps, Charles Hastie, the 15-year-old, the oldest one in the family of the boys who died, may well have been involved in some kind of indecency or other.
Near Selby Street, on the other side of the railway tracks, was a public toilet. Ron decided to invite all those known to use it regularly to help the police with their inquiries.
Lee was one of those 20-odd people. I put to him, as I did to everyone else arrested or interviewed that day, the fact that I believed he was responsible for causing the fire. It was hunch, just a feeling one has. And having put this to him, you are responsible for killing those Hasty boys, he immediately uttered the words, I didn't mean it.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Sorry, I didn't mean it.
That didn't prove that he was responsible for the fire, but it certainly linked him with the telephone call. And of course, then he went on into some detail. The amount of paraffin he'd used, which was corroborated by the amount the forensic scientist had found at the house, and the matches that he'd used, and the paper that he put through the letterbox. So all the time, as he chatted on, things perhaps only I knew were falling into place, and the corroboration was building up. And it was quite something, quite amazing.
On June 9th, 1980, 6 months after Seager's early morning call, Ron arrested Lee for the murder of the Hasty boys. He had no idea of the horror stories to come. Ron Seager's painstaking work and his uncanny intuition had finally solved the Hasty murders. But who was the small, pasty-faced 19-year-old he had in custody?
Lee spent most of his childhood in children's homes in the Hull area, like these, known as Hessel Cottage Homes. In later years, Lee spent irregular periods at the Salvation Army Hostel in Hull. He was never in one place long enough for anyone to know him well.
He did resent people who lived in decent homes, people who had families, and he was brought up in children's homes, one home after another, and gradually as he got into his teens, and he was left to live wherever he could, on the battle of wits that he had. And of course he resented people he saw going home in the evening, resented people who were decently dressed, resented people who were enjoying life, and frankly he wasn't enjoying life at all.
As Lee's resentment grew, so did his fascination with fire. But none of his many carers had an inkling of what he was capable of. At the age of 12, he was returned to his mother, but she couldn't cope and after a few brief months put him back into care.
Mum was struggling, no man at home, children, mouths to feed, and she did the best she could. So Lee had a very, very difficult life. Nobody liked him, he was a loner, nobody loved him, and therefore he lived in his own mind. He lived in his own little world.
Lee's world was the crumbling back streets of Hull. He had a mental age of 10 and was partially crippled. A loner, he was rejected by everybody, including the sister of the Hasty boys.
He used to hang around with the boys, and like he used to hang around with us, and just before the fire happened, we was walking off at the bridge and he said to me, "Will you be my girlfriend?" I said, "No, I don't like you, and you're too old for me. I'll go home." He said, "Oh, please." I said, "No, you're scruffy, go home."
A minor grudge led to murder. Lee told Ron Seager that he resented Charlie Hasty's demands for small amounts of money, so he burnt down Selby Street. Seager suspected such a slight motive could mean he'd killed before, and his suspicions were confirmed.
A woman named Ros Fenton made contact with one of my officers and said, "You know, the man you have in custody, I think he's responsible for causing a fire at my home." And I then went to see this lady. She'd been badly burned in a fire. She told me her story about the fire and her suspicions all along, but no one had been along to see her.
He admitted responsibility for that fire and satisfied me, not just with an admission, but satisfied me with the detail that he was responsible for that. And not wanting to have an awkward silence with him, I said, "You know, Bruce, you've killed before, haven't you?" And as simple as it might seem, he said, "I killed a baby once, you know."
It was an extraordinary confession, perhaps one only Seager could have achieved.
Lee trusted him, and then he gave him all the information, didn't he? They struck up a rapport, which not all policemen would be able to do with somebody of Lee's character.
I don't think any other policeman, or I wouldn't say any other policeman, but the archetypal policeman, you know, of that era who was seen to have heavy-handed, you know, you cough, we know you done it, mate, that sort of thing. Whereas Ron went in there and said, I understand where you come from. I understand your background. I understand that you've been knocked from pillar to post. You've never had a home life. You've never felt loved. You've never felt you've had a mother who was there or a father there to support you, help you, guide you. And Lee said, absolutely.
Seager asked Lee directly, why was he admitting to setting other fires?
And he said, you know, and I used to tell people in homes that I've been dragged up, you know, and I've been kicked from pillar to post. Then out of the blue, you told me the very thing that I've always believed. And I thought, you're being honest with me. So when I feel like it, I'm going to be honest with you and tell you just what I've been doing. I know you suspected me, but you didn't really know, did you?
And I think Ron became a father figure to Lee. The first man, the first person who actually understood him, appreciated where he came from, and then it all came pouring out.
He simply continued to talk about things that I found totally incredible. And on one particular occasion, a man was seen at the door of his flat in Humber Buildings in Hull. His clothing was burning. He died 6 days later. Lee had the audacity to go into that house. He found the man who died. He found him lying fast asleep on a settee, a leather settee. They poured paraffin over him when he was asleep and set fire to him and disappeared. It transpired that the same man had clipped Lee across the ear at one time because Lee had allegedly stolen his pigeons.
Lee confessed to fire after fire. The most tragic, 3 years before the Hasty fire, killed 11 elderly men in an old people's home. The rest, all within 1 square mile of Selby Street, were judged to be domestic accidents by the police officers sent to the scene.
In those days, in the 1970s and before that, I'm quite sure, the police would attend, and quite frankly, on many occasions, they would jump to conclusions. Oh, she probably smoked in bed. Oh, perhaps the children were playing with matches.
And when Ron then went away and went back to the experts, the fire experts and everybody else, on each fire that he admitted, and they re-examined the evidence, they said, yes, this could have been or was started deliberately when you look at it in a different light and a different angle.
That's right, and Ron actually felt sorry for him for a long time, didn't he? He felt quite sorry for Lee. Yeah. But then when as the story unfolded, as I think he said on the film, I stopped feeling sorry for him then.
June 1973, a 6-year-old boy dead. Fire investigators at the time blamed a possible build-up of gas from a leaking cooker. October 1973, a 72-year-old man.
In all, Lee confessed to setting 10 murderous fires.
December 1974, an
26 people died as a result.
A 13-month-old baby boy. January 1977, a 5-month-old baby girl.
Time after time, the police and fire service missed the real cause of the fire.
December 1979, the Hasty fire, when 3 boys died, the only detected case of arson.
The coroner's verdicts went unchallenged and were simply wrong. Seager had uncovered Britain's then worst mass murderer. Lee pleaded guilty to manslaughter with diminished responsibility. He's serving an indefinite sentence in psychiatric prison. He appealed, but was found guilty of all but the fire at the old people's home. Despite the enormity of Lee's crimes, the case of the Hull Firestarter is strangely little remembered. Lee's image little recognized.
There's an element of that kind of kitchen sink murder about it. I'm afraid it was from a deprived area, and people outside that area would not be that interested, unfortunately. They should be, but that's the reality.
It didn't land on the desks of the news editors and the editors of the big nationals in London. They saw this, as you quite rightly say, a grubby murder, no manhunt, no big search, man in custody. It never hit the headlines in the way that the Panther did, the Ripper did, Shipman did, any of those stories.
And one has to say it, it's Hull. And Fleet Street, where is Hull? Where is Hull?
Where? Exactly.
I'm afraid.
Yeah.
And it's still probably
It's north
the
of
case.
Watford Gap.
It's north of Watford Gap.
When asked by me what were the reasons for his causing the fires, he says, well, despising people as I do is because I've never had a home of my own. I've always seen other people go into homes, but I've always been in children's homes. I've never had a home to go to. I've never been like other people. And because of that, I've despised those people who've been in homes, and I chose to set them on fire.
The case of Peter Lee was seminal in crime detection and the way, just as the Ripper was, just as Shipman has been, that it's made people sit up, take note that, you know, you can't be complacent and you shouldn't be complacent. And I think in those days there was not a deliberate complacency, but there was a complacency, and I don't think the fire brigade nor the police were as advanced technically in their investigation procedures as they are today.
But whether you could identify and stop another Lee, I mean, it's questionable, isn't it? I don't know how you do.
If another Lee appeared in this world, it could happen again. Houses are destroyed, the evidence goes with them. And Lee was one of those who had no presence. He could wander around anywhere and hardly anyone would see him. He's only a small stature, partly crippled. Who would think that under that jacket of his, he had a can of paraffin and matches in his pocket, and all he was interested in, morning, noon and night, on occasion, was to set fire to somewhere. And that's exactly what he did.
And he walked up to me and he said, I'm sorry to hear about your brothers. And I said, oh, it's all right, Bruce. I said, not your fault, is it? And little did I know that he'd done it. If I'd known then that he'd done it, he wouldn't be alive today. I'd be in prison. Because I would have killed him for doing what he's done. I mean, he's destroyed my family. Absolutely destroyed it.